Hello everyone, I'm the Black Shadow, and welcome back to another episode for Top 5, a series where we take a specific topic for the world of Dune Imperium, and I give you my tips and tricks to help improve your game. We've started looking at Bloodlines. The previous video was looking at all the new additions, commanders, techs, that sort of stuff, and a bit of a wide-sweeping arc. But now we're going to start looking at the actual leaders, the 9 leaders introduced to Bloodlines, in a bit more detail. And we're going to be starting off our look with Duncan Idaho, who is probably the leader that I think I've used the most since Bloodlines came out. So Duncan Idaho is a fairly battle-orientated leader. He's rated at just a 1 pip of complexity, as you can see at the top there. But I do think he's actually pretty solid and pretty flexible on the whole. He kind of quite has a counterpart to, say, Gurney Halleck. Whereas Gurney Halleck is very good at just producing troops to get into the conflicts, Duncan instead uses the agents he deploys around the boards and puts those into conflict to act as combat strength as well, which is kind of wild, but is actually quite a lot of fun. And it does mean that he does have a lot of flexibility early on. He's not particularly shuttled down a particular path or two, and you kind of react to the game state a little bit here. And it means that he's always harassing combat as well, whether you're just trying to pick up loose resources, you need a bit of extra firepower to win some early fights. I do think, though, that he has a bit of a struggle sometimes later on in the game, though, as the game develops, there's more garrison troops around, intrigues become a thing, people have access to Highliner and that sort of stuff. It does mean that Duncan's strengths kind of peter out a bit, so you do need a good start with Duncan, but I do think that he's a lot of fun and is definitely a pretty solid point if you're kind of getting used to Bloodlines and trying to learn all the stuff that's going on. So let's have a look at Duncan's abilities in a bit more detail. We'll start off with his passive ability here, Ginaz Swordmaster, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it's straightforward and very simple. You get a discount towards purchasing your Swordmaster. Usually the Swordmaster space costs 8 Solari, or 6 if someone has already got a hold of it. And for Duncan, he gets a 2 Solari reduction, whatever is the case. At its most basic principle level, it just means you're getting your Swordmaster faster. It means that you're not as heavily reliant on finding a ton of Solari early on, and it means that places and things that might give you Solari sooner, like either with contracts you can fulfill or hitting Spice Refinery, are a bit better for you, because it means that in theory, if someone's already bought their Swordmaster and you've got no cash, you can just go to Spice Refinery, pay a Solari for 4 Spice for 4 Solari, and you can buy your Swordmaster, which is pretty nice, because otherwise Spice Refinery is a bit of an iffy spot for some other people to go to early in the game. But of course, it means that if you're having to spend less money on your Swordmaster, it means that you can use that money on other things that you might decide to go ahead and do. So it means that maybe that 2 Solari you're going to need to spend there, maybe you're going to gather support and you're going to pick up a war along with those troops. Maybe you can use that 2 Solari to pick up one of these very attractive looking Sardaukar commanders early on. Or maybe what you might decide to do is go heavy after commanders initially in the first place, thinking, well, that I get my discount on Swordmaster, and so I can get it a bit cheaper later on. You decide to do this first. It's definitely an option that you can consider, and it does, again, give a bit of flexibility for you to kind of react to game state a little bit with Duncan Idaho, which I think is always nice. And I think if you're trying to pick up Bloodlines and kind of learning what's going on, then that's definitely very useful. There's also, as well, a couple of intrigues that definitely it helps if you've got that money, which is definitely a bit on the loose side. It means that, you know, if you find stuff like contingency plan to give money, or even backed by Choam, and you still need your Swordmaster, you get into that a lot quicker. Sleeper unit, paying that Solari to put a spy down doesn't feel so bad. And of course, the big one is going to be this one here, buy access. 5 Solari for 2 faction bumps is always really, really strong. But for Duncan, when you're basically getting a 2 discount Swordmaster, which is something you're going to be going for, it means that cards like this that have that heavy Solari requirement suddenly don't feel anywhere near as far out of reach. So definitely very, very, very useful. But the passive plays into Duncan's ring ability, which is super cool. Into the fray. You may take the agent you sent this turn with your ring, and you can deploy it to the conflict as a 2 strength unit that can't be retreated. But if you have your Swordmaster, hence the discount, it gives 3 strength instead. This is a totally unique ability, although CJ might have something to say with his Canleys about that, but that's a story for another time. But it means that, yeah, you can literally, in addition to getting your troops, throwing those into a conflict, you can go to, like, Arakeen, for example, and as well as, you know, you can send in the troop you recruit, you can send in the 2 from the garrison, but you can also put your own agent into the conflict for strength as well, giving you a really, really cool shot factor in trying to go for fights that maybe look quite appetizing for you. Now, there are a few specific things that are affected by this being able to deploy the agent. Notably, the agent can't be retreated, which is generally not a big deal, but there are a couple of cards that have effects for retreating troops and units. Charney Clever Tactician, for example, is one of those. Also, if there is an agent effect of an opponent that makes you lose troops, this is still safe, don't need to worry about that. It also means that for intrigues like, say, Distraction, which require you to send 3 or more units of conflict into a turn, the agent you sent in does count for that, to make something like this a little bit easier to complete. It's a minor thing, but something definitely worth pointing out. But the really cool thing about the ring ability is that, if you read it here, it just says wherever you send the agent to this turn. And it means that, yeah, you can send it to like Arakeen and get the shot factor and get the additional troops, but it means that you can actually send your ring to a non-combat space. I don't know, let's say Accept Contract, for example, and then you can still put your agent into the combat to give you some strength into that, which means that you're effectively turning the likes of the Landsrad spaces and these 3 in the early game into effectively combat deployment spaces. Obviously not officially. You can't send any garrison troops in, but you can still put your agent in, which is quite useful. It means that this is quite effective as kind of an anti-limping strategy, because it means that in the first couple of battles, when people know that you're going to have your ring about, it makes it difficult for like Hasbia to say go to like Fremkit, for example, Imperial Base, and just kind of limp the troop in to look to get that 2 Solari, because it's very likely that you're going to have your ring and you get to throw your agent in, and effectively it's going to be for free. You don't have to spend the troops, so he's either got to put in 2 troops to fight for that, which is more than he'd like to commit, or he's just to say, you know what, it's not worth it. You might have some daggers as well because you're drawing cards, and you just get the limp resources basically on the house, which is really, really nice. But there are a couple of potential downsides to the ring ability. Because of the fact that you're using it to, say, send the agent to do something, it does mean that a place like Assembly Hall here, where you need the agent on the space to get the persuasion reveal, it means that if you were to then send your agent to the combat, you do lose that. So just be that slightly in mind. Also, the thing you've got to bear in mind is because you're freeing up this location with your agents no longer there, it means that, say, Muad'Dib, if he wants to go to Assembly Hall, he can now do so. And it means that you've got to be a little bit careful when you decide to use this and where you decide to use this. You are encouraged to use the ring either to somewhere at the very end of a turn when everyone is basically running out of places to put agents, or maybe you're like the last act, so it doesn't matter if you free up the space, no one's got anywhere else to go. Or if you've got somewhere that you have unique access to, so maybe you can get to Siege Tabor before anyone else. Maybe you can get to, if you can send your ring to your early Swordmaster before anyone's got the money, you can just chuck that in there. Shipping is another potential location, but you just got to be a little bit careful about that. If again, sending your ring to like Arakeen might look really good for a lot of shot factor, but Arakeen is also a really popular location anyways, and people like going there pretty much every round. So if you free us up with your agent, someone's probably going there after you, and that might be pretty bad for you. So you just got to be a little bit careful about that. But still, all in all, a pretty cool ability and pretty good. Although, as the game goes on, as noted, the impact this has is minimized. If you can get the Swordmaster, like +3 swords is not nothing, but when there's like lots of strong intrigues out there that give you 3 swords or 5 swords or 7 swords, suddenly this isn't looking particularly strong. So it's more just a bit of extra firepower for fights you're going for, and it's not going to be able to do too much more than that. But still, it's better than nothing. So the next thing we're going to have a look at is seat position. And I think this is something that is a little bit trickier to know nowadays with Bloodlines. I do think in the world of classic Dune Imperium, Definitely, I think some leaders have more defined, strong, and weak seats. And I think even with Uprising on its own, I think when I did the previous series, there's definitely some tendencies. Bloodlines, I think, blurs that a little bit. I think there is a little bit less worrying about where seats are because the spy mechanics exist and such like that. And there are some abilities that do mess with other leaders and influence how they work. But there are still definitely, I think, things that tend to work. Duncan, again, wants to get hold of that Swordmaster as soon as possible. So not a bad place for him to go is probably third or fourth seat, assuming that red is first seat here for the purposes of this demonstration. The reasons for that is that you're less likely to get blocked to Swordmaster when you pick up the money. It's not difficult for Duncan, in seat 4 or 3 to look to hit like one of these mining spots on, say, round 2 when there's some built-up spice, hit Spice Refinery afterwards, be set basically to go for Swordmaster very quickly. No one's going to be getting in the way of you by the time you're first to act. You should be ready to get the Swordmaster. Also, because you're always threatening into the fray with your ring, but especially in the first round, it makes life really difficult for anyone else if they want to limp for this initial reward. It's really awkward for them to do so because you could just basically chuck your ring in with a dagger or two behind you and basically render any limps that they're going for just wasted troops. So they're kind of forced to either get more troops than they'd like or just abandon trying it altogether. So that can be a bit troublesome for them. Seat 3 is also pretty good as well because you think when you get to round 7 and there's tier 3 conflicts, Seat 3 is the first person to act. So it's a good place for Duncan if he needs to get to Highliner quickly, maybe a research station, one of those 2 spots. You've got first priority getting those. But again, if you've got spy access that you've been building over the course of the game, then the seat position probably isn't as big a deal. As such, I would probably advise trying to avoid some of the earlier seats here with Duncan. As noted, he does need, I think, a pretty decent start usually in games, and a lot of that is with combat-wise. And because of that, obviously, if you're in these earlier seats, in those early fights, you have to declare your combat strength sooner, and into the fray can be countered by more players, because they can wait to see if you've got the ring and if you use it, and then they can make a more accurate decision on how best to fight that, if they want to go for that first reward. Trying to win first place as Duncan in, say, first seat looks a lot harder than if you're sitting over here where you can just threaten people. It's kind of the old Beast strategy that I used to employ a lot back with Dune Imperium. You just sit with Beast in 4th position and you just threaten your ring at people, and unless they're going to go Hardy Warriors and just absolutely pump combats, in which case they're probably overcommitting for reward anyways, it makes it really hard and tenuous for them to really commit properly and know they're going to win the fight. So I would probably avoid going seat 1 Duncan where possible, although it can work itself out sometimes. Of course, if you're going early, you might be, especially seat 2 can still make a fight for going towards throw-in access, but seat 1 is probably one I would avoid. I just don't think it really suits any of his game plans. So we're on to the 5th section for this video, and this is the wildcard tip section. Basically what this is things I think are very relevant to the leaders and are quite important to point out, but don't really fit into any of the above categories, but I think are well worth highlighting. So for Duncan, as you've noted, because he has the Swordmaster cheapness and it strengthens into his ring and kind of bolstering that, you're obviously encouraged to go down a Swordmaster route and kind of play a more kind of traditional way of playing the game. Which means that basically what you're trying to do with Duncan is kind of action economy bully your opponents in combats. In those sort of early to middle rounds. Basically, again, if you're trying to sit in a backward seat as well, what you're basically trying to do is make people's lives really uncomfortable with battles. So in those sort of middle rounds, when you've got these juicier conflicts coming up where people want to get involved with them and they want to then win these, they're really nice awards. They don't really know how much to commit because you've got the action on them. If you've got the garrison, you're threatening your ring. It's hard for them to know how much to commit. So they've got 2 choices. Either they overcommit for rewards because they think I've got to win this and they just go in a lot heavy to try and deter you from going for it, or they basically kind of sort of give up a bit on it and can give it to you really cheaply because they just think that you're going to go over the top of them. Either way, it makes their lives really uncomfortable, and it's something that you need to try to leverage as best as you can. Also, as already noted, Duncan's ring does definitely lose potency as the game goes. From my personal experience, it feels like about, round 4-ish onwards, is where the ring starts to take a dip in its effectiveness, and definitely once you get in towards the tier 3 fights, it's basically just free swords, largely speaking. So do bear in mind that as you're getting involved into further into the game, what you're going to be doing towards the mid to late game, whether that's getting involved obviously with Imperium Road cards that give you extra swords on strength, obviously cards that give you troops generating into the conflict, stuff like that, are going to be ultimately a lot more effective for winning fights than just your ring. You can't rely on your ring to win fights, and even for limping later on as well, people will be prepared to put in 2 or 3 troops to pick up third place rewards because it's well worth them doing that. So bear in mind that's something you're going to have to take into account. Also techs as well, whether that means that you're going to need to get discounts or skills of getting hold of more commanders, whether that means you're going to need the like of rapid drop ships or other cards that give you more combat potency as well in order to supplement your combat strength later on in the game. Ultimately, these are going to be more important in your ring as well. So do not rely on Into the Fray to carry you throughout 7 or 8 rounds of the game. It's just not going to do it. And one thing I will definitely add as well with Into the Fray, and I kind of mentioned it earlier as well, is that if possible, if you can find ways of sending your ring to places that people just cannot access, then it makes playing Into the Fray a lot kind of easier. One thing I do sometimes with Duncan is either rush the Emperor or the Spacing Guild. Usually, if you're in the back seats, you ain't getting to the Fremen anytime soon. But what you can do, if you go maybe like double deliver supplies to pick up spice, is you can maybe send your ring to the shipping space to get hold of the money for Swordmaster if you haven't already got it yet and get more faction bumps. But this is a space that doesn't get hit very much at all. So you can pretty reliably send your ring here and get it into the combat without having to worry about anyone else getting involved with that. Imperial Privilege is also a decent spot as well to get early. Some games people get there pretty quickly if they're going heavy after desirable contracts. Try saying that 10 times really fast. But regardless, again, if you can get your ring to places people can't access, even getting to the Swordmaster in the first place because you got there really quickly, then that does make Into the Fray. The one downside of having the space open for your opponents afterwards, and then you kind of forced to play your ring kind of late, doesn't really make much of a difference anymore. One nice thing as well, I will lastly add as well, if you have a way of being able to deploy troops, sending Duncan and his ring to gather support to pick up these troops, maybe even the commander and his ring, and then using something like rapid drop ships to just send all of this in because you bought the tech at the same time, is really, really destructive and typically pretty hard for people to counter. So yeah, a lot of good stuff going on with Duncan, but you do need to supplement his abilities as the game goes on. But that's going to do it all for this video here for top 5. So thank you much for watching and listening. And yeah, hopefully you guys can give Duncan a bit more spin. As I say, I do think he's a lot of fun. I enjoy the fact he's pretty flexible. It means I can kind of play a little bit more laid back, a little more chilled. There are definitely some leaders that are a lot more demanding, I suppose, on the player to kind of make sure to get use out of them. But Duncan can kind of go with the flow a little bit and is always offering that early battle harassment at the very least, picking up some nice rewards on the cheap, especially if people decide to empty out their garrisons early and don't do a very good job of replenishing them because they just don't have the cards or not hitting deployment spots very much. Duncan gets so much use out of it Into the Fray. It's a really, really strong ring ability. And ultimately, like, if you've got to send your ring to somewhere like Accept Contract and you give it up to someone and they hit it as well, it's not a disaster. So just be wary that if you're heading to like more city deployment spots, it's tricky. Mining areas isn't so bad, except if, say, Worm's available at Haggard Basin. There you might want to be a little more cautious. But otherwise, you know, a lot of fun to be had with Duncan Idaho. Anyways, take care of yourselves, everyone. Have a good day, and we'll see you all in the next episode.